Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fanfic Reread Project. Today, we are beginning the reread of Prophs 2.0, which is going to be the second of our 4 Prophs rereads. This section is called Prophs 2.0 because it is the one section that forms a cohesive story. It is not completed, but it is sequential chapters instead of being chapters that were pulled out of stories. So the reason why this qualifies as Prophs 2.0, despite having clear connections to the stuff that we read in the last version in some ways, is because in the midst of me getting ready to try and continue this, I changed the names of all the characters again. I mentioned this the last time that I tended to use other languages as ciphers for the languages on Planetos because due to all the changes I was making and the fact that, especially when I was writing this back in 2013, those languages weren't fully fleshed out, in particular Valyrian, and we still don't have a version of the Old Tongue, but I needed those, so I use real world languages as ciphers for the different stuff, as well as adding some stuff in there, but we can talk about that more when we actually get into it. So the chapters on this are not numbered, so I'm not going to try and number them because I will lose count very quickly. I always do. As well, the first part of this first chapter is also missing. So we are going to jump right in, but that means that I'm going to have to catch you up to speed by detailing what the beginning of this is. My theory is that I took the beginning of this and used it in a later edit of the story. So basically, this skips the prologue from A Game of Thrones and goes straight to the first Bran chapter. And the chapter, just like in the book, opens with them performing an execution. However, instead of going to Castle Ser, well, not they didn't go to Castle Serwyn, but they went to lands near Castle Serwyn in the books. This time here, they go to Deepwood Motte, which leads to them having to trek back through the Wolf's Wood at night. I wonder if that'll be significant. But this begins, I think, right before the execution. So, yeah. Also, just like last time, I am going to try and translate the names back to the versions from the book. Not because I can't pronounce them, because most of these I can get a handle on. There are a few names, because there were some Irish names in here that I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce. But generally speaking, I can pronounce the names. However, this version was originally written with the Elvish names, and then I later search replaced it with the real world language cipher names. So it's very back and forth on what language everything is in. So while you'll have some things where the characters' names have actually been translated over, you'll have others where they're still in Elvish, and yet others where I search replace the names back to the ones from the original text and never translated them to the new thing. So it's very weird, and trying to read Mona went to Deepwood Motte and saw the Elvish name here. It's very strange. So I'm just gonna try and translate everything back the original names. So we're gonna jump right in part of the way through this chapter. So I think they had just arrived at Deepwood Motte here. He had suspected that his mother was also worried about the forest as well. They needed his father that day, which meant that they had to travel through it instead of circumventing it by traveling east. Even leaving early in the day, they wouldn't return to Winterfell until well after nightfall, and his father only took a small group of men, maybe 20, including both of his brothers and his father's ward and himself. His sister had told him stories about the massive packs of wolves that roamed the woods, and that they were massive monsters with fangs that could tear through bone and slavering jaws, but his father assured him that they were just stories. The wolves in the Wolfswood were regular-sized. I kind of like that. So he, in this instance, is Bran. Of course, this paragraph actually has a good example of the unchanged names because Winterfell is called Castle White, which was its quote-unquote Scottish/Irish name, but the Wolfswood is called the Wolfswood. So, moving on. The Wolfswood never was translated out of English. It just had its name changed. Deepwood Motte was an old castle built atop the only piece of raised land for miles around. Tall, dark walls made from the wood of the sentinel tree rose around the uneven brownstone courtyard at the foot of the hill. The small crowd gathered in front of a short, wide tree stump that had been turned to stone by the ages. Bran stood beside his half-brother Jon, who stood beside his eldest brother Robb, who had the ward Theon on his other side. The men of Deepwood Motte dragged out a ghost of a man by his arms. His hair was matted and greasy, and his skin was retted and covered in sores. The cloak around his shoulders was so worn it torn in spots, and his leathers whitened at the elbows. Frostbite had taken 3 of his fingers. Bran wondered briefly if he wasn't already dead, for he didn't move when they dropped him on the stump, but he caught the tiniest bit of movement under that tattered cloak. "Wilding," he heard Jon whisper. "How do you know?" Theon responded. "Why else would they kill him?" Jon said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Because he's a murderer," Theon reminded him. "Oi, you two," Robb said, flicking Jon on the back of the neck. "Quiet." "Sorry." Jon glared at him. His father, a tall and somber man, stepped out of the crowd and moved to the stump, followed by Jory Cassell, the captain of his guard. Jory lifted the man by his hair, and his father leaned down until their eyes should have met. "Is there anything you must say?" Bran could not hear whether he responded or not. His father narrowed his dark gray eyes, and Jory let the man's head fall. Father put out a hand, and Theon stepped forward with the great sword, Ice. The blade was as wide as even his father's hand, long as Bran was tall, and made of cloudy blue-gray dragon glass. They called it glass, but it cut cleaner than any steel. "Don't look away as he lowers the blade," Jon whispered to him. "Father will know if you look away." Bran did as he was told, and kept his eyes trained on the stump as his father spoke. "In the name of Hobert." King Hobert. "In the name of Robert of the House Baratheon, first of his name, king of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros, by the word of..." What's his name? Let me do that again. "In the name of Robert of the House Baratheon, first of his name, king of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros, by the word of Eddard of House Stark, lord of Winterfell and warden of the North, I sentence you to die." I am so sorry at my cadence there, but I had to translate like 7 different things. Good lord. The sword sliced his neck in one swing, and his blood painted the stone deep red. He didn't look away, but he didn't know if he could. The sight was mesmerizing in a morbid way. The head rolled down from the stump, propelled by the shallow incline of the yard, until it came to a stop right in front of them. Oh, God. That greasy dark hair covered his face, and Bran couldn't help but be grateful for that. The older boys weren't bothered by it at all. He saw Theon staring at it as well, but the look on his face was closer to amusement. He started towards it, but Robb turned his head sharply and whispered, "Don't even think about it," so hard that it sounded like a hiss. Theon narrowed his eyes, but he stepped back. A man just died. Why am I laughing? This shouldn't be funny. Jon leaned down to him again. "You did well," he said with a laugh on his voice. "Father will be pleased." Let me pause right there. God, we're 10 minutes into this, and I read like 5 paragraphs. I will say that these little moments, as kind of inappropriate as they are, they do a good job of establishing the characters. It's not the most subtle thing in the world, but it does what it needs to do. You can clearly see that Robb is the mature one, that Jon and Theon are slightly less mature, but in different ways. Like, you clearly see the dynamic between the 3 older boys, and then sort of with Jon and Bran here. And I think, as far as I can remember, the rest of the chapter does a pretty good job of showing that off too. So let's keep going. The sky was burning red with the sunset as their caravan passed through the castle gates. The shadows shifted with the cool evening breeze as it blew through the trees. The older boys rode at the very front of the group, with Bran pushing to keep up on his pony. "He died brave enough," Robb started. The sunset made his red-brown hair burn, and the shadows turned his freckles dark. "How do you know?" Jon said. He didn't even move. With his black eyes and deep brown hair, he looked more like a Stark than any of his whole siblings. His birthmark was darker than both his and Arya's, and even their father's. "Exactly. He didn't fight his fate," Robb said back. "If you say so," Theon said with a shrug, "though I don't know how brave that is. He was a Greyjoy of the Iron Islands, with sea-green eyes and salt-blonde hair and light brown marks that trailed down past his right eye. I thought he was half dead as it was. Did you see the bloke? He had frostbite." "So," Jon said with a shrug. "What kind of wilding gets frostbite?" Theon continued. "It would be like an Ironborn getting ship's rot. And in the summer, too." "It's been summer for ages, Greyjoy," Jon reminded him. "Either way, he probably lost them before he even got to the forest. It's always deep winter near the wall. And he was obviously off his rocker as well, stumbling into Deepwood Motte like that," Theon added. "I could have told you that, Greyjoy," Robb said, rolling his eyes. "He killed 3 people. Don't give me sarcasm, Stark. Bran laughed for the first time as Theon mimicked his brother's tone. But honestly, Jon said after the laughter had subsided, what do you think he said? Theon shrugged. Doesn't matter. He's dead now. The words always matter, Robb said. If they didn't, my father wouldn't bother to listen. So, like I said, it shows off the dynamic pretty well. This is also really important, I think, because in the books, Theon is not only older than Robb and Jon, he and Jon don't get along. So establishing that all three of these characters are around the same age, and the fact that they are all like pretty close and jokey with each other is kind of important because it establishes the differences between the source material and the fan fiction. One thing I will say is that Bran is kind of cutting a mysterious figure in all of these character interactions, but I think we get more of Bran's character from his inner monologue, which is why it kind of sucks that the beginning of this is missing. But let's keep going. As they trekked deeper into the wood, the red turned to purple, then purple to indigo, and indigo to black. Bran couldn't see the stars through the canopy, and the moon was too weak to reach the floor. The orange flames of their lanterns seemed like orbs floating in the dark of night. The boys had to fall back once the sun set. Bran rode between his father and Jory. He could hear the older boys talking in hushed tones behind Hullen, the stable master. We're doing it again, guys. We did this last time, too. Do you know why I had to do it? His father asked him quietly. His tone had changed, and he had dropped back into the brogue of their region. He could hold the silver tongue with the best of them, but he didn't bother once he was among his house. So there are multiple instances in both this and Prophs 3.0 where a character is said to speak what's called the lengua de plata, or the silver tongue, like I said. But at different points, it is referred to both a language and an accent, which confuses me because with the language, it sort of makes sense. However, we have to start getting into like little details to explain why it doesn't make sense. But suffice to say that the silver tongue is a very specific language that is spoken in a specific part of Westeros in later versions. So it doesn't make sense that it would be the official language spoken in any kind of official context, because the place where it comes from is the Vale, and the official language is the language of the Westerlands, which makes sense because in this version, the Andals come from over there. So what makes even less sense is when the silver tongue is referred to as an accent, because why the fuck would Ned go to an execution in the north and then start speaking with a southern accent? That doesn't make any sense. In what official context in the north would he need to speak with a southern accent? It's very strange. Bran was quiet for a minute in thought. He was a wilding, he finally said. They steal women from below the mountains and take them to be eaten by the king beyond the wall. You've been listening to your sister's stories again, he said with a chuckle. There is no crime in being... Okay, so we have another problem. And this is a thing that has popped up in other versions of Prophs. The idea that the area beyond the wall has like a proper name. As recently as Prophs 4.0, this was a thing. However, I don't have any way to really translate this, because what else do you call them except wildings, or the free folk, I guess. There is no crime in being the free folk, child. They have the same ancestors as we do. They're just on the other side of the mountains. Robb said he was a murderer, Bran tried. He was, and he killed those people for no reason. There isn't a man more dangerous than one who commits crimes for no purpose. But you mistake me. What I'd meant was, do you know why I had to wield the blade myself? Bran couldn't think of a reason, and his father must have read it in his eyes. Our ancestors believed that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. If you sentence a man to death, you owe it to him to look him in the eye and hear his last words. If not, you'll become too comfortable ordering the deaths of others. Execution isn't something to take pleasure in. We still hold those principles. Many Northerners do. His face darkened, though I can only speak for myself on that last one. We'll discuss that when you're older. Who could he be talking about? I can't think of anyone. The soft chirping of insects filled the silence that followed his father's words. Occasionally, a wild raven would fly by, only noted by the flap of its wings. Bran had thought the forest would be louder. He wondered where all the animals were. Did they sleep at night like he did? Some must, he supposed, but what about the wolves? He was spooked by the thought that they might be out there right now, hunting and doing whatever other terrible things wolves might do at night. But he tried to calm himself. His father told him that wolves did not attack men unless provoked, and he couldn't think of anything that he might have been doing at that moment that would make them angry. "My lord!" a voice cried out in the darkness ahead of them. The caravan stopped, and Bran jumped halfway out of his saddle. He'd completely forgotten that Hulin's son had scouted ahead of them. "What is it, Harwin?" his father shouted back. You should come see this." The older boys were off their horses before his father thought to set his feet on the ground. He did not see them go, but he heard them crashing through the underbrush. He and his father and Jory dismounted their own horses and followed after them. "Bloody hell," he heard Robb say. Bran quickened his pace as he followed the lanterns through the wood. The shrubs of the underbrush seemed to materialize out of the darkness as the lights passed them by. When they came upon Harwin and the boys, they were standing over something lying on the ground. He couldn't see past them to see what it was at first. I think something that's interesting that I want to bring up now, and hopefully I'll remember to comment on it in later episodes, is that it is interesting to see who finds the wolf in each different version. Because here, as we see, Harwin is the one that finds the wolf, but in some later versions, it's Robb and them who find it instead, and I think it's just interesting to see like how that changes and what it might represent. Here, it doesn't represent anything. Harwin found the wolf, but anyway, let's keep moving. "Bloody hell," Jory echoed under his breath. The sound of the phrase again made him push forward to see for himself. At first it looked like a mass of gray fur, but when he craned his neck he could see the wolf's head on the other end of the huge corpse. He really couldn't believe the size of the thing. He could just barely see its mouth hanging open, revealing the black gums and stained fangs. Its eyes hung open and stared up at the canopy. Bran was reminded of his sister's stories. A growing sense of unease filled his stomach. "Look at the size of it," Robb said in awe. Theon was just staring at it with an odd look of distress on his face. "It's so big." "It's a dire wolf," Jon informed him. "They're bigger than regular wolves." "They haven't been seen in the north for over 200 years, Robb said in disbelief. "Well, I see one right now," Jon said back. Theon shot him a look. Also interesting is measuring the reactions of the different kids to the wolves in the different versions. The sound of whimpering tore Bran's attention from the grisly sight. Robb was holding something in his arms, and when he moved from his father's side, he saw it was a tiny cub with fur the same shade of red-brown as his brother's hair. Its little body moved rapidly with its quick breaths, and its eyes hadn't even opened yet. "You can pet him if you want," Robb said down to him. The little thing was warm under his touch. The fur was incredibly soft. "Are there more?" Bran whispered. Jon spied him and then answered, "There are 4. He glanced up at their father and then placed one of them into his arms, a little thing with orange-brown fur that went light around its eyes. His face lit up when it curled into his chest. Okay, so let me pause here, for real this time, and mention that I think we ran into our first proper run-on sentence here with Robb was holding something in his arms. Yeah, that sentence is very, very long. I don't know why. Also, another thing to note when we get to like Prophs 3.0, pay attention to who picks up the first wolf and again the reactions and stuff. All of that stuff's important because as the story moves on, these actions and reactions gain a lot more weight. In this version, as I read it, there isn't really a lot to what's happening here that means something maybe different from what was in the source material. But in later versions, that's not the case anymore. So let's keep going. "A dire wolf south of the wall after all these years," Harwin said. "It's not good." "It's an omen," Jory said. "We don't take stock in omens," his father said firmly. "How did she die?" "There's a wound on the neck," Robb said. "I couldn't see it properly, though. It's underneath her." His father moved behind the thing, grabbed its side, and pulled it onto its back. There was a messy, crusted-over wound so wide that the insides had spilled out and started to rot into the dirt. Okay, well, hold on. I'm very confused at how long this wolf has been dead. It's been dead long enough that the insides are starting to rot, but the babies haven't died yet? Now, mind you, I'm no scientist, so I don't know how long decomposition takes, but I don't know, something about that seems a little off, but let's keep going. Jory kneeled down and inspected the ragged flesh at the edges of the wound. "Lion," he said, looking at the father. "I've seen the bite marks before, but they've never been known to travel this far north, and it shouldn't have given her any trouble." "And yet it seems to have ripped her throat out," Harwin said. "That's odd. That's very odd." "Could it," Hulin started, "just maybe have been a Blackmore? What is that?" The briefest of silences passed between the group, one that he didn't quite understand, and then his father shook his head. "Impossible. They've been extinct for centuries." Either way," Harwin began, "I'm surprised she lived long enough to whelp." "Maybe she didn't. She might have been dead when the pups were born," Jory said. "How?" Jon said to him. He shrugged. "I've heard stories." He turned back to father. "What will we do with the pups?" "They'll have to go," he determined. Bran let out a cry. "What?" Why? They'll die out here if we don't, Bran. Better to do it now than to let them starve. No! The tears stung at his eyes, but he blinked them away. He didn't want to cry in front of his father, not on this day. I want to keep it. A direwolf is no pet, son. Bran looked to his brothers for help. One of the hounds whelped recently, Robb said, catching his gaze. She'll have enough milk for them. She'll tear them apart when they try to feed. Jon stepped forward then. Lord Stark, he said formally, there are 4 pups, 2 male and 2 female. I've noticed. You have 4 true-born children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Your children were meant to have these cubs. Bran felt his heart swell. He had left himself out to make the count match. He couldn't believe it, but Jon always did have a sense of selflessness when it came to his siblings. Father considered this for a moment. You don't want one for yourself? The direwolf is emblazoned on the banners of your house, my lord. I'm not a Stark. We'll feed them ourselves, Robb interjected. I'll soak a rag in milk and he can drink from that. Me too, Bran added. Then you'll train them yourselves too, Father started. Don't pass them off to the kennel master or any of the servants, and God's help you if you decide to mistreat them. When they're grown, they'll be able to rip you in half. Treat them with respect. He paused to take a deep breath. Are you still sure you want to do this? Yes, Bran said. They might still die. They won't, Robb said. We won't let them. Then gather the others. We're expected back in Winterfell. Father started back toward the caravan, Jory and Harwin behind him, while the older boys picked up the other 2 cubs. Jon's head popped up at the sound of another whimper. He must have crawled away from the others, he said. Or he was driven away, Theon murmured. Jon bent over and scooped up a pup with ghost-white fur. Its bright red eyes shined in the lantern light. It was strange. The others were brown or gray, and none had opened their eyes yet. Once they had all the cubs, the boys followed behind their father and made the trek back to the group. Bran walked in between them, his pup tucked into his cloak. He couldn't wait to get back to the castle, and he hoped his mother wouldn't make him go straight to bed. He was wandering back to the caravan when he stopped right in his tracks. There was a rustling noise in the underbrush, gone as suddenly as it came, but then again followed by a small flash of something. What is it? Robb said to him. He didn't answer. He could feel his brother shifting behind him, but he didn't move. He stared into the tangled plants, and a pair of icy blue eyes stared back at him. Theon reached his hands into the bush and pulled out a pitch-black pup by the scruff of its neck. Is he one of them? Jon asked quietly. He's so far away from the others. Theon shrugged. Well, if he wasn't then, he is now. And that's the end of that chapter. That's a weighted line. So, this chapter really wasn't that different from the chapter in the book. All that said, it is interesting to see how different the North became later down the line versus this version, where all of the characters' reactions are pretty close to exactly what happened in the book, barring Theon's reaction. Theon has a much more subdued sort of reaction to the wolf instead of like, it's a freak and gotta kill the pups and like all that stuff. But in general, I mean, this chapter was fine. It was written well enough. I definitely did have some problems with the prose, but it wasn't anything like super serious. I just think there was an overuse of the word the. It's very strange, but it definitely like kind of messed up the rhythm while reading. Otherwise, the chapter is fine. It's not as annoying as some of the other 2013 stuff that I've read, but I also might be misremembering how annoying that stuff is. But it's fine. It does exactly what it needs to do. It is perfectly readable, perfectly passable. As you can see, just like in the other version here, Theon also has a wolf. I wonder what that could mean. So in this version, we are going to be referring to Theon's wolf as Shadow instead of Mordred, because that is apparently what the name meant before. So going from there, let's jump into the next chapter, which is Jon, I think. Yeah. He thought it was too bright. It was the dead of night, but all of the sconces in the hall were lit in anticipation of their impending arrival. He thought it was too warm, too. He had discarded his cloak as soon as he entered the doors. He squinted against the flickering flames. He wished they could put a few of them out. The boys were hoping to make it to the lower sitting room before anyone could intercept them. Robb had insisted that they name the pups that night, but it was late, and they knew that Bran would be taking the bed if they were found. Robb was hissing at him to keep from running. He was so excited. He couldn't blame him. He felt it too. Jon was at Robb's side, his cub in hand. The little thing squirmed in his arms, nipping at his shirt and pawing into his chest. He wondered why his pup was so ornery when the others had yet to even open their eyes, save for Theon's, but he also found it endearing. They were able to descend the first staircase unnoticed. The hard stone kept their footsteps quiet, since they were careful. The second and last was made of wood. They all paused. Even barefoot, they would make a bit of noise. The other wooden staircases were the same. He'd known that from the times his siblings had been caught sneaking to the kitchens. I feel like this whole thing about the stairs has to be a reference, which is weird to say, but it feels like a reference back to that original first John chapter that we read last episode. I don't know, it just feels too not pointed, but too particular, oh, the stone ones didn't make noise, but the wood ones, I think it was like a reference for myself to be like, haha, remember that. They began down the staircase. They got halfway without incident, but Bran hit the middle stair a bit too hard. The creak made them all wince. I feel like I'm watching Scooby-Doo. Oh my god. They were still for a few seconds and were going to start again when someone cleared their throat behind them. Where are you going? It was Lady Catelyn. She was still in her day clothes and her auburn hair was pulled back from her face, making her pointed features seem more severe. John had known her no other way. Actually, let me take that back. It doesn't make me feel like I'm reading Scooby-Doo. It makes me feel like I'm watching a sitcom reading Scooby-Doo. I definitely feel like this is something that would happen in Full House. Oh, good lord. Just to the sitting room, Mother, Rob said, trying to save face. John suspected it wouldn't work. His brother was a master of many things, but lies were not one of them. It's late. We weren't tired? His inflection made it sound as if he were asking a question. She would not fall for it. They were caught for sure. She raised an eyebrow. It took her a moment to notice the pups, but when she did, her eyes widened. Is that a wolf? Bran spoke before the other boys could stop him. It's a dire wolf, Mother. Oh, God, Bran, no. Rob rushed to fill in the silence before she could speak again. Father said we could keep them if we fed and trained them ourselves. There's more than one, she replied. How many? 6, Bran piped up. All 3 of the older boys grimaced again. This feels like a sitcom. To be fair, though, unlike the last chapter where it's kind of it's supposed to be this dark and somber mood, a man dies, and then you kind of have the boys, bants with the boys afterward, is kind of what? Here it feels more appropriate because it's just family time. 7 hells. John was shocked. He had never heard her curse before, but he didn't let it show on his face. Where is your father? She said to Rob. He went to the Godswood, he answered, to clean the greatsword. At this time of night, she sighed. I'll speak to your father about this, but if he said it was all right, then I suppose it is. John noticed that she gave him a look as she turned to go back up the stairs. Her steel blue eyes were hard. They continued the rest of the way down the stairs. John was glad for the darkness. It was cooler down there, and his eyes were starting to hurt from squinting. He knew it would not last. Rob sat the cubs he was holding on one of the chairs and lit a fire. John winced as it roared to life. A pounding noise followed the path they had just treaded. Is it true? Arya said, bursting through the door and rushing towards them. Are they really dire wolves? Her light blue eyes were wide with excitement. How did you hear so quickly? Rob said. Sansa, she replied. She heard you coming. Of course she had. Sansa could hear almost anything. Rob picked up the pup next to his and placed it in her arms. She giggled as it nipped blindly at her dress. The sound of someone descending the stairs reached them again, but this time it was slow, noted only by the sound of the wood creaking under their feet. Sansa appeared around the corner, hand gripping the wall. She was a willowy girl of 13, the splitting image of her lady mother, with large, round, silvered eyes. John wondered if she had come all the way by herself. Are they really dire wolves? She said, uncertain. Did father really let you keep them? You have one too, John said, sitting on the couch. I know, half-brother, but they're monsters. Over here, you. Arya took her by the arm and practically dragged her across the room. They're not monsters, you'll see. Don't grab me so tightly. You want your pup, don't you? I'd also like to have arms. You already almost knocked me over when you came barreling down here. Honestly, Arya, that's no way to act. Is that all you care about? Not now, you two, Rob said. He always stepped in between the two during their arguments. John could never do it. He loved his sisters, but their bickering was tiring. Theon placed the pup in her arms. She was small, possibly the smallest of the litter, and a soft gray and white. She dug herself into Sansa's arms, seeking her warmth. Her face softened. I told you, Arya said. What will you name her? Said John. Lady, she answered immediately. I'll call her Lady. Arya rolled her eyes. Of course you would. Let her be, Rob said. She can call it whatever she wants. He sat in the largest chair by the fireplace, usually reserved for their father. He looked downright kingly. John moved to his brother's side, perching on the armrest. I know what to call mine as well, Rob said, holding the pup up with both hands. That's good, Sansa said. He'll be strong, just like our father. He smiled. John liked the name as well. It reminded him of stories from beyond the wall and the powerful winds that blew across the snowfields of the lands of always winter. Sure. What will you call yours then, Bran? John asked. He stared down at his pup. I don't know yet. Well, mine will be called Nymeria, Arya said proudly. Nymeria? Sansa scoffed. That's barbaric. Okay, so I think it's worth noting here that in this version, the wolf actually wasn't called Nymeria. She was named after a woman who had married in the House Bolton, who was kind of famous, and that woman's name was Ava, but I changed it back because I'm realizing now that that kind of doesn't make sense, so I might have to call her Ava, or actually I think it's pronounced Eva. I might have to call her that anyway because this is not going to work with the Nymeria thing, and it just makes Sansa sound racist. So let's step back and reread that again. What will you call yours then, Bran? John asked. He stared down at his pup. I don't know yet. Well, mine will be called Eva, Arya said proudly. Eva, Sansa scoffed. That's barbaric. Theon moved behind their chair and leaned on the back. Here we go, he said under his breath. Sorry. She'll be strong. She'll be a monster. I'd rather that than... Robb stepped in then. Both of you stop it. She can name it whatever she likes. Fine then, Sansa said loftily. It's your own fault if she goes feral and maims us all. She won't, Arya muttered. She'll only come for you. You little... Stop. His voice was commanding. He had a penchant for channeling his Lord Father when dealing with his sisters. They both fell silent. Arya glared at Sansa, then plopped down on the couch. Bran still stood in the middle of the room, looking doubtfully at the pup in his arms. What do I call him? He asked, worried. I don't know what to call him. Calm down, Jon said. You'll think of something. What about Winter? Theon suggested. That's simple enough. I don't know. What about Ice, like Father's sword? I'm not sure. Snow, then? No. Silver? But he's not gray. Umber? He is brown. I don't think so. They were all quiet then, thinking. Well, you don't have to name him yet, Jon said. How will he call him then, said Robb. I don't know. Theon shrugged. Sorry. Theon shrugged. Point at him and say you. Robb narrowed his eyes. What about you, then, Greyjoy? What will you call yours? The pitch-black pup lay on the rug, staring into the fire. Jon couldn't tell whether he was entranced or bored. Shadow. That's more... Oh, well, this doesn't make any sense, but, that's morbid, Sansa said, wrinkling her nose. Theon tapped Jon on the head. What about yours, Snow? He was silent for a minute. The snow-white pup pawed at his chest. Names flicked through his head, any number of them, but there was one that stuck on his mind. When he looked up at him with his bright red eyes, he knew for sure. Ghost. Morbid, Sansa repeated again. I like it, Robb said. Jon smiled. There was no better name for his pup. Robb reached over and scratched Ghost under the chin. The flames danced in the fireplace, making every shadow move along in its rhythm. He winced as the dull pain started in his forehead. Damned lights. And that is the end of that chapter. So, I actually found this chapter much more interesting than the last chapter. I think it's because the last chapter sort of just felt like I was reading, like, a plagiarized version of, like, A Song of Ice and Fire. Barely, even. It kind of just felt like I was reading it, but with, like, a few changes. This chapter, on the other hand, is, like, complete original content. And I think this chapter does a really good job of embodying what I said last episode about how all of the POVs in these stories were the kids. So none of the adult characters, like, I think it's mostly Ned, Tyrion, and Cat, are featured here. It is all the kids, and in this one it's all the Stark kids and Theon. So with that chapter, you do see how instead of seeing Cat going to the Godswood and talking to Ned, you get instead the kids naming their wolves, which is, I think in the books she says it's kind of happening at the same time, or it happened before that technically. But I think what is most interesting about this chapter is also the fact that it does a really good job of introducing you to the dynamic of the various, like, Stark children. And it does a good job of introducing you to the children themselves, especially because, like, Sansa and Arya weren't in the last chapter. This chapter also does a really good job of foreshadowing, or hinting at, something that's going on with Jon that I won't get into detail about. And I don't know if spoilers really matter. We'll leave it for now, but suffice to say that it does a really good job of mentioning all of these symptoms that Jon has, and the fact that, like, we don't really know what it is now, but as you were supposed to read through the book and the series, you would have become more aware and been like, oh my god, it was all right there, you know, like that kind of stuff. But yeah, overall, it was pretty decent. Also, surprisingly funny. I enjoyed that. So I'm gonna try and read one more. I think this episode may or may not be over an hour, but that's fine. So we are now going to another Bran chapter. The day had dawned curiously gray, as Bran was sure they would have sun. He was forced out of his bathwater by his mother into the chilly air of the washroom. He didn't think he would get colder either. He pushed it out of his mind as the servants patted him dry. What did he know of the weather? He was dressed in the finest of the black and gray today. He looked absolutely rich in the velvets and silks, and his hair had been brushed until it looked like chocolate. He'd been scrubbed so hard that even the dark marks that covered the left side of his face turned a shade of red. Under his blue eyes, however, it just made him look more like his mother. The lady herself wore a stunning gray gown trimmed in black, her auburn hair tumbling down her shoulders. When they both reached the bottom floors, they were wreathed with sumptuous black furs that gleamed in the muted sunlight. So here's a change that I did not register until right now, is the fact that the Stark colors are apparently black and gray. This was a thing in the last one too, and I never thought to mention it. Also, Bran's eyes are blue. This is interesting. One thing that's been pretty consistent throughout Prophs is the fact that the appearances of the children are based more on the TV show than they are on the book. Because in the book, 99.9% of the Stark kids that are Ned and Kat's kids look like Cat. But in the show, it is much more of a mix where you get half and half, sort of like Robb, and to a lesser extent Arya, and then you have Rickon on the other hand, who looks straight up just like Ned, but small. And then on the other opposite side, you have Sansa, who looks just like her mom. So definitely this is based more off of the show. The fact that Bran has blue eyes but he has brown hair is supposed to be based off the show, but of course Bran's eyes are brown in the show. But moving on. The whole of their house had turned out in front of the castle, from the guard to the servants, all looking their absolute best. His brothers had been shaved, and Theon as well, and his father's beard neatly trimmed. Sansa's hair shined like beaten copper, and her gown was the same shade of shining silver as her eyes. He was arranged so that he was at the end of the line next to Sansa, but with a space between them for the currently absent Arya. Robb stood on Sansa's other side, with Jon and Theon behind them. As soon as he started to wonder where she was, she appeared. "Where were you?" his mother whispered, removing a helm that had somehow made its way onto her head and brushing down her hair again. Arya didn't have an answer. When their mother left to take her place beside their father, she turned to him and said, "There's something I have to show you when this is all over." That piqued his interest significantly. Problem here, pronoun game makes it sound like Arya turned to Ned and said that when she was talking to Bran. But anyway, they were shushed as a great sea of people approached them through the gates. There were hundreds of them, a giant wheelhouse among them, riding under rich blue banners graced by a silver serpent with great antlers gracing its head. All right. When they stopped, the large man that rode at the very front hopped off his horse and approached his father. "Ned, it's been too long," he said jovially. Father bowed his head. "Your Grace, Winterfell is yours." Bran was actually shocked. The king was not the man he'd expected, but the crown of silver antlers he wore on his head confirmed. He was fat, with a round belly, and his black beard concealed neck rolls, brand new. All right. The king was of impressive height, however, at least half a foot taller than his father, and had eyes in a piercing shade of blue. Not as light as shadows, but not as dark as his own. The king looked him up and down, him being Ned. "You've gotten fat," he said disapprovingly. He saw his father tense, and then his eyes flicked down to the king's immense gut. The king let out a laugh and pulled him into a crushing hug. The king then moved to his mother and hugged her like he was his own sister. Yeah, like I said, for some reason that moment from the show is in almost every single version of this chapter. I think actually it is every single one, and I don't know why. Is it that funny? I don't think it's necessarily hilarious. But moving on. The rest of the party began to dismount after that. Queen Cersei came from the wheelhouse bearing a heavy fur over her shoulders on the arm of a boy who he assumed was Prince Joffrey. Prince Tommen and Princess Myrcella stood beside them. All four had the red gold hair of House Lannister and the reddened spots that were known to cross their faces, but wore the colors of their king. The queen's two brothers, however, were both clad in their purple and gold. Lord Jaime, again, Jaime is a lord. We're going to talk about that because I totally forgot to even mention that in the last episode. Lord Jaime was a magnificent man with hair in shining red gold and rich velvets. He looked more than the knight he had once been, like he could be a king himself. Lord Tyrion was a small man, maybe 3 feet tall, that had to be helped from his horse by an attendant. Bran couldn't help but notice that his hair was a darker shade than the others, and one of his eyes was dark blue, where his siblings were both emerald green. Interesting. Huh. Interesting. Anyway, so about Jaime, the thought process behind Jaime not being in the Kingsguard but not also being like fucking dead is that I think he was pardoned for killing King Aerys, but he also gave up his knighthood completely. Something like that. There is a later version of Prophs that talks about this more in depth, and what that version says is that Jaime threw off his cloak as he killed the Mad King, then said that that was like him giving up his knighthood so that he could kill the Mad King without violating his vows. And Bran rightfully points out that that's not how that works. But I think we're working on the assumption that he was just pardoned by Robert because he killed the Mad King. Another thing I want to note is that I really don't understand why the Lannisters had their house colors changed. Though that seems to be a common thing in this version, so I'm willing to excuse that. But B, why they had their hair color changed. Like that, on the other hand, seems kind of pointless, because from what I can see here, the Starks for the most part look the same. Ned even still has gray eyes, like in the book. The Lannisters have like red hair. They're gingers now? Like, why is that a thing? Not to mention that their red hair and then like purple and gold as their colors. I feel like that doesn't look very good, but anyway, that is purely cosmetic. The queen looked at the gray stone walls of the castle in awe and blushed when his father kissed her ring. He got a feeling that Lord Jaime was less impressed. When the children were all introduced to each other, he found Prince Tommen to be rather agreeable, and Princess Marcella was sweet enough. He knew Arya wouldn't like her a bit, which his mother wouldn't like a bit. Joffrey seemed quite taken by Sansa, and he swore he saw Robb and Jon and Theon straighten when the prince kissed her hand. And Theon! Once the formalities were over with, the king turned to his father. "Take me to the crypts, Ned. I'd like to pay my respects." The queen straightened, but didn't say a thing as one of the servants ran to fetch them lanterns. He knew that the king wanted to pay his respects to his Aunt Lyanna, who had passed many years ago after she had been kidnapped by Prince Rhaegar. The other servants led the rest of the royal family into the castle. His family followed behind. He felt someone remove his cloak as soon as he stepped through the doors, and the cold air seeped through his shirts. He felt someone else pull him into a room and shut the door behind them. Pausing very quickly, number one, note that Cersei in this one doesn't, like, nod. Like, Cersei is a very, 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 very different character in these stories, but not so different that she would be like, "Oh, I'm totally okay with you going to mourn your ex." That just doesn't seem like in character. But also, in this first sentence that we read, like he felt someone remove his cloak and the cold air seep through his shirts. That's what I mean by like a weird overuse of the word the. Like I could have just had him say cold air seep through his shirts, and it would have said the same exact thing without that weird little extra like note. That's a small thing, but it does affect, again, the rhythm of the story. So let's move on. "What are you doing?" he said before he had even turned around. It was Arya, he knew. He was surprised to see Ava and his pup there as well. I'm sorry if I pronounce that name differently every time, but I'm gonna try and stick to Ava here. "What do you want to show me?" he asked her. "We have to wait for them to clear out," she said, putting her ear to the door. "But what—" He was immediately shushed. "Listen to this." Sorry, I just thought about Back to the Future. He came and pressed his ear to the door as well. "Is that any way to speak of my husband, brother?" he heard a woman say. "The dead would wait, dear sister," a man said back. He knew immediately that the woman had to be the queen. They were talking about the king and his aunt, but who was the man? He looked to Arya, who mouthed, "Jaime." "He's the king. If he'd like to go to the crypts as soon as he comes on the grounds, he can," the queen told him. The lord's voice became lower. "Doesn't it bother you that he still kneels at the feet of his former betrothed when she has been dead for 17 years? You act as if she would steal him away," a third voice said. Bran mouthed, "Tyrion?" to which Arya nodded. "He should be kneeling to his queen," Lord Jaime said. He and Arya looked at each other again. The voices became so low that he strained to hear through the wood. "He is insatiable," Lord Tyrion said, "but even Robert would not bet a corpse." "Are you so sure?" Jaime said back to him. Arya's eyes widened amusedly, but Bran's jaw actually dropped. "Really?" the queen said, sounding disgusted. "You both go too far." The hall seemed to go quiet after that. Did they really have the gall to speak of the king that way, in front of the queen? Did that really happen? He asked Arya, still in shock. "Kingslayer," she spat. He couldn't help but be shocked again. He'd heard that only the common folk still called him that, and even they whispered it. "He's going to be a right pain in the arse, I can feel it." Bran was too dazed to say otherwise. Get used to that scene. Get used to everything in this chapter, because for the most part, this stays the same throughout most of the versions. There is a later version that does add a few little changes, but That conversation in particular manages to stick through every single version because it's meant to introduce you to the tensions within the royal family, specifically between like Jaime and the king, and then like Jaime and Cersei, and Tyrion's kind of there. Spoilers, but Tyrion disappears in later versions. So, not like super soon, not the next one, but the one after that. I think he's just straight up gone. But it's meant to introduce you to like the tensions as well as like the characters and stuff, you know? But let's keep moving on. Arya cracked the door and peeked out, then motioned for Bran to follow. They moved slowly and quietly, with the pups exiting nonchalantly behind him. They're dogs. How do they do that? Once they made it to the doors, Arya took off in a run towards the Godswood. Bran and the pups followed. He couldn't think of what she might have found once they disappeared inside the fence. The wood shone like it stood in the brightest of sunlight despite the clouds. His father had told him that the light of the old gods shone on it even when the sun was concealed and the moon was absent. Arya led him past the stony sentinels and gleaming pines to the glassy pool of water under the heart, a tall tree with black bark and black-red leaves and many twisting limbs. The bleeding tree never seemed to stain the thing, though the ground around it had been thoroughly reddened. And again, the equivalent of the weirwood looks different. This appearance is closer to the way that it looks for the next few iterations of prophs. All throughout Prophs 3.0, which covers actually a few different versions, but generally speaking, I consider them all kind of the same. Every version of the tree in that one, I'm pretty sure, is the black one with, it has like straight up red leaves instead of black red leaves, but still. It's in there, Arya said, pointing at the pool. What is? Look into it! He did, and at first he was sure she was going mad. The pool was so clear that you could see right to the bottom, and there was nothing there. But as he looked longer, he did see something. Right in its center, something was glowing, a dim white light of some sort. He thought that it might be a reflection, but it definitely seemed to come from the pool itself. What confused him is that there was no source, and he should have been able to see it perfectly. What is it? Bran asked her. I don't know. She was cut off by the sound of a splash. They both went wide-eyed as Bran's pup swam under the surface of the pool. They can do that? He asked, bewildered. She didn't answer. Ava let out a yip and pawed at the ground. The other pup came bursting back out of the pool with shining yellow eyes and something in his mouth. Arya jumped forward to take it from him. They both ducked as the pup shook himself dry. Bloody hell, Arya said as she looked into her hands. She held a necklace, which was not what he had been expecting at all. A slim jewel set in silver, hanging on a thin chain of the same fine silver. The thing really did glow and cast a small white light on Arya's face. How had this gotten into the bottom of the pool? He asked Arya as much, but she only shrugged. His first thought was that it was a family heirloom that had been lost. His family had always valued simplicity where others were gaudier. He still couldn't think of how it had gotten into the pool, though. Oh, what should we do with it? He asked her. I don't know, Arya said at first, but then replied, I'll keep it. I found it. Bran didn't know whether he should disagree or not. He did get a strange feeling from the thing. He didn't much like it. And that is the end of that chapter. That's kind of a weird note to end on, but all right. For the most part, this basically the same as the Joffrey chapter that we read in the last version. It's just written slightly differently because my writing style changed between then and this. But despite the slight changes in perspective, like how we overhear this conversation and that stuff, there really isn't that much different up until the part where they go into the Godswood and find the necklace. What I will say is that this necklace is a strange kind of element in the story, and I'm not entirely sure what it was meant to represent. I know what it was connected to. That becomes obvious to me anyway, as you get deeper into this version of the story, but I'm not entirely sure why it was added and what it was meant to do. But anyway, outside of that, this chapter was fine. It was all right. I prefer the later versions of this chapter that are written from Arya's point of view. We'll get to those in the next stage of the reread, but I feel like it feels weird to have like a Bran chapter, a Jon chapter, and then another Bran chapter, just kind of pacing wise. I feel like we should be introduced to the characters sequentially if we're going to do the all kids thing, you know? But anyway, it works for what it is. It does what it needs to do. It's the same as the first chapter. It is what it is, you know? So I'm going to stop it there because we are going on an hour now. Next episode, we will be picking up with Arya's first chapter. If you like this, don't forget to favorite. Is favoriting still a thing? Like this on the YouTube. Comment, subscribe. Don't comment. I don't like comments. But yeah, so I'll see you guys next episode. Bye.